Have you ever heard the expression, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain? That's kind of Adobe's MO for quite some time now. At least that's what a lot of us think anyway. But why is it still so popular? Why are they raising prices if people are leaving? And how did it kill some pretty well-known desktop publishing applications? I mean, how did it even survive the death of Flash? Adobe is a beast that is so large, with so many applications, you can cut one head off and it still would thrive in today's world. It's ingrained not with just graphic designers, but photographers, web developers, architects, movie makers, hell, even Judy down the street who has to open up a random PDF every day. A world without Adobe is a world most of us don't think can exist, and Adobe knows it. They were the mythical David and Goliath story, the little guy, the creative guy, the new kid in town who invented things that weren't there before, changed the landscape of desktop publishing and took the impossible and made it possible. Adobe helped to put Apple in the hands of so many creatives and pretty much created a micro-singularity moment, maybe twice? How did that turn into one of the most hated companies right now? I'll let you in on a secret. It starts with subscriptions and ends with AI. Man, this is going to be a hell of a video, and yes, this is being created with Adobe Audition and Premiere Pro. Go, 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 go. Before we get to the reason why everyone hates Adobe, you first have to understand how Adobe got started.
Xerox was never going to be able to enter the computer business. They just simply didn't understand it. So in 1982, decided to leave and start Adobe.
Before Postcript, there were about 250,000 graphic artists. Now there are at least 25 million.
Guys, we're going to out-invent the best.
Postscript is the reason why freelancers, small design firms, personal printers, hell, fonts exist today. Without Postscript, you might have never seen so many of these at the market, arriving in your mail or hanging them on your wall. So what is Postscript? It's an interpretive language or a page description language used for digital printing, meaning it takes what's on screen and translates that to what comes out of a printer. And I know, well, duh. But before this was invented, you couldn't do this. That printer collecting dust right down in the corner of your room wouldn't exist. Co-invented by these two guys, they are the reason we don't use dot matrix printers anymore, and the reason why we can print so many beautiful fonts or images at a pretty low cost to ourselves. You see, before Postscript was released in 1985, fonts were based on a simple grid system and could really only be printed on dot matrix printers. Which, if you've ever seen that, you really can't design flyers, brochures, or pretty much anything. No, what was used for design was photo typesetting. It was expensive and was not something you could set up at home or a small office. You had to pay for it. And if you screwed up on the design, that was a lot of money wasted. That was until a little computer came out that changed the world.
All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated by what's in that bag.
Macintosh. What else can one say? If people weren't talking about the Mac itself, they were talking about the Mac commercial.
In 1984, the Macintosh was released, and following that came Postscript, which included scalable Postscript fonts. Steve and the team at Apple saw the writing on the wall and was creating a printer specifically designed to have Postscript installed. It would become the first laser printer with Postscript, eventually giving desktop publishers and designers a WYSIWYG editor of sorts for the first time. So Apple licensed Postscript from the newly formed Adobe, along with a new program called PageMaker, which was kind of a proto-InDesign. So I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but Adobe was founded in December of 1982 by two former Xerox employees who worked at PARC, who left because they wanted to implement Postscript and graphic programs, but Xerox wasn't interested. They weren't having none of that. The aforementioned John and Charles founded Adobe in a garage, as most things were at the time. It was named that because Adobe was a name of a creek behind John's house, and the logo was created by his wife, who was a graphic designer and kind of was a test subject to a lot of early Adobe programs. Maybe I shouldn't have pluralized that, but we'll get to that later. Now, going back to their first application, Postscript, it really was a singularity moment because it basically killed photo typesetting in an instant. An industry that has been around since the 50s was deemed obsolete the second a home printer could print exactly what was on someone else's screen. And photo typesetting was used by everyone. I mean, before the 80s, anything that was printed was done with this technology. And remember when I said Xerox didn't want to invest in Postcript? That may have been because they were pretty invested and even made photo typesetting machines, which hindsight is a funny thing, right? It reminds me of Kodak, where they were the industry-leading camera and film manufacturer who actually made a digital camera before they were a thing, but shelved it because they thought it would hurt their film industry. Guess what? And even today, Postcript is still the industry standard. I don't believe we've come up with something better in all that time. It was such a hit, Steve Jobs tried to buy Adobe for $5 million to own Postcript. He knew how powerful that tool could be, and this is 1982 money, so about $17 million in today's inflated paper cash. But instead of selling the company, they sold shares to Steve worth about 19% of Adobe. Steve paid a 5-year license to Postcript, which is why a lot of people associate design hardware with Apple. Because if you want to print anything, you did it with an Apple product. Well, an Apple laser printer to be more exact. Because while you could see the Postcript fonts and graphics on screen, the printer needed the Postcript software to work, not the computer. But where did Postcript come from? Why was it a need? In the late 70s, John had a vision of Adobe Illustrator, but the technology just wasn't there. So when he joined Xerox in 1987, he kept thinking about a vector design program that would revolutionize the design world. Now, a lot of you might not remember life without Illustrator, and while I started taking design classes in 1998, I was taught first the old ways of design, so I used stuff called French curves, used the letraset system for radial corners, or a rapidograph to design first. And it would take hours to build out a design, where now it might take 20 minutes. And a lot of the tools you had limited your designing on what you could do. Say you wanted to do specific curves in your design, but you didn't have that curve via the letra system. You really couldn't do it then, unless you had a compass. Not that compass, this compass. So when Postcript was created, it paved the way for Illustrator because now you had software that could create smooth vectors and hardware that could print those vectors. And finally, almost 10 years after the first thought of Illustrator, in 1985, Illustrator started development. Unlike a lot of the programs we're going to talk about, Illustrator was an Adobe creation, and when Adobe showed off a simple curve on a computer screen, the design world, the desktop publishing world, lost their f***ing mind. I mean, think about it. For the first time, you didn't need to buy proprietary tools to help you design. You didn't need pens anymore. You didn't need to rely on physical curves. You can design your own curves. You could build digitally. It gave precise controls, and with the addition of the undo command, what would have been a costly mistake was gone in an instant. That's the second snap. I don't think you understand how important that undo command was either, or Illustrator as a whole, or Postcript. Going back to the rapidograph, that pen was a pain in the ass, man. Say if you were an hour into a design, on occasions that pen would decide to just leak half its ink onto your work, and that was your master file. So if it gets screwed up, you'd have to start all over again. An hour of work down the drain, and it might happen again. You never know. The pens were great, but they were also the worst thing you could ever own. But now, with Illustrator, if you made a mistake, it could be fixed. The first demo was that of a rose. John drew a rose first on tracing paper, and it was recreated in Illustrator. So many curves, so many lines, and for the first time, a program took that hand drawing and recreated it perfectly. It was revolutionary. It was a moment that changed history, changed the way we thought about design, art, productivity. In 1987, Adobe went to the consumer market with Illustrator, which was exclusively on Apple Macintoshes and ended up making $19 million in just the first year. Obviously, this was a tool designers wanted. The same year, Photoshop was invented, but not by Adobe. Instead, two brothers, Thomas Knoll, who had a PhD, and John Knoll, wrote Photoshop's program on a Macintosh Plus. It displayed grayscale images on a monochrome display, and they decided to create a graphical image program with the new creation. The first actual product name was called either Image Pro or Display, I'm not really sure, but was later renamed to Photoshop. Originally included with a slide scanner as software from Barney Scan, they later gave a demonstration of it to Apple, but they weren't interested. Then they showed it off to Adobe, and Adobe purchased the license. They didn't actually buy it, but in 1988 it went to distribution via Adobe. In 1990, Photoshop 1.0 came out to the Macintosh exclusively, again with the hefty price tag of $895. However, it was revolutionary. Again, in its own right. You could manipulate photos, erase items you didn't want in the picture, adjust brightness, contrast, even create graphical elements. What would take an entire darkroom and development session turned into a few minutes, and with the onset of digital cameras, Photoshop became the new darkroom. It became the new development studio. Eventually, Adobe bought it outright for $34.5 million, but like I said, not actually an Adobe creation. I don't think a lot of people know that too. In 1991, the portable document format, or PDF file format, was created. The goal was to capture documents from any application and send it to view on any machine without losing the format. Mail. So if you didn't have the font installed on your computer, that would be fine. If you didn't have the original image of a linked picture, it would be fine. It was a revolution in its own right, and in 1993, the PDF and Acrobat format was shown off. It has become a staple in office life and is probably one of the most used words or term in our language. In December of 1991, Adobe released Premiere, which was renamed to Premiere Pro in 2003. Originally developed by this guy, the program started its life as a working demo for a QuickTime editor called Realtime. Randy was working on digital recording cards, essentially a hardware card that lets you input camcorders to your computer to pull the video. This was before consumer digital recording, so getting video from a camcorder to a computer was almost impossible. The card his company created was meant to be the handshake, but the company had nothing to show off what you could do after you transferred that video. So Randy built a simple editing program that lets you cut the film and edit it on your home computer. It was essentially the first non-linear editing system, and that's extremely important because you know how I said Postcript was kind of a singularity moment? Well, Premiere is kind of in that wheelhouse too. Because before Premiere, you literally had to sit with miles of film and actually cut and combine film reels to make a movie. This was a specialized process, took many hours, and was very expensive. But with the arrival of digital editing, all that was gone. In an instant. That's the third one. Now, the way we make movies, the restrictions on who could make edited movies, changed forever. In 1992, After Effects was created by KOSA, or the Company of Science and Art, which was later purchased by Aldus Corporation in 1993 and was finally acquired by Adobe in 1994. Now, 1.0 was a very primitive piece of software, with no timeline window, one effects per layer, no transfer modes, no motion blur, and only one mask per layer. Yeah, you try working with that now. But if you wanted to create any worthwhile special effects, you had to use expensive, developed proprietary software on computers that cost more than a house at the time. However, KOSA couldn't finish the program and ran out of money, which is why Aldus purchased them and released 2.0, or After Effects, in 1994. This featured time layout windows, image sequence support, motion blur, multi-machine rendering, frame blending, and for you 4K footage lovers, proxies. But after that, in the same year, Adobe purchased them and released 3.0, which gave us pretty much the modern day equivalent of the program, including render queues, time remapping, keyframe assists, multiple effects per layers, advanced keying, and a lot more, including Illustrator and Photoshop integration. A little known fact was the original Jurassic Park movie heavily used After Effects and won a lot of awards because of those visual effects. Now, a little known fact was in the 26th of May in 1992, Charles was actually kidnapped. That's pretty crazy. So apparently after work one day, two men came up from him at gunpoint. They threatened to blow up his house and kidnap his family if they didn't get money. His wife was at home at the time and was worried that Charles hasn't called her yet. But when the phone did ring, it was the kidnappers who threatened to kill Charles unless she came up with $650,000. After that, she allegedly went to a public payphone, fearing her phone was tapped, and warned Chuck in fear that he would be next. She then called two stockbrokers to get the money. Chuck called the FBI and told them the whole story. It took about 4 days to come up with a plan to get the kidnappers. So Charles's daughter wore a wire and drove to the kidnappers' location with an FBI agent hidden in the back seat. After the meetup, they finally rescued Charles with the two kidnappers sentenced to life in the state prison. That is wild, man. I didn't know that until I was researching this story. That is wild. In 1994, Adobe purchased Aldus for $500 million. Aldus made PageMaker, which became Adobe PageMaker, which was a desktop publishing app. It went up against the powerhouse at the time, Quark Express, and could not compete with the last release, 7.0, in 2001. While it died out, Adobe was working on another desktop publishing app codenamed Shuxon, Shuxin, something like that. Later called K2, it was originally started by Aldus and became Adobe InDesign in 1999. But here's the juicy part, because in that purchase was a program called Freehand, which was a very similar application to Illustrator. When Adobe got the application, the FTC stepped in and said Adobe was creating a monopoly and had to sell Freehand back to the original owners. And now you kind of see why I was mentioning which programs were Adobe and which were just bought. You see, they were creating a monopoly. They were taking these revolutionary programs and yes, improving and integrating them into their apps, but there was no competition. Any program that tried to compete didn't have the feature set or were straight up purchased by Adobe and either integrated into their own programs or killed off altogether. Founded in the early 90s, Centrillium Software created Cool Edit Pro, a digital audio workstation for audio input. By 1999, the program split into two programs, Cool Edit 2000 for simple use and Cool Edit Pro for professionals. In 2003, Adobe purchased the company and its assets for $16.5 million, and it became Adobe Audition. Now, in September of 2003 came the first iteration of Creative Suite, or CS. This was their offline version of the entire package, with Creative Suite 1 being Illustrator, InCopy, InDesign, Photoshop, ImageReady, Vision Queue, and Adobe Stock Photos. The suites went up to CS6 with the final release in 2012. And remember, when I say offline version, this will come into play very soon. Remember earlier when I talked about Freehand and how Adobe had to give it back because the FTC said they were creating a monopoly? Well, in 2005, Adobe purchased Macromedia for $3.4 billion, which was funny because Macromedia bought Altsys, which gave them the rights to Freehand and went back into the hands of Adobe, and as such was hit with a class action lawsuit in 2011 because of what? That's right, creating a monopoly in design programs. Kind of again. But what was the result? A settlement with Adobe by which members of the Freehand organization received discounts to Adobe products and a promise for product development of Adobe Illustrator based on their request. Oh, and with that purchase of Macromedia, Adobe purchased Dreamweaver and Flash. It was said by Adobe's CEO at the time that the purchase was really for Flash, with probably $3 billion of that purchase going towards the program. April 2010 marked the letter Steve Jobs published on the official Apple website called Thoughts on Flash. When the iPhone was heating up, there was a lot of talk on why Flash products don't work on the iPhone, like games or websites, because once upon a time, entire websites were built on Flash, and yes, it was as much of a nightmare as you would think it was. Well, Steve had a lot of thoughts on the subject and decided to write a letter to the world. He went on to say Flash products are 100% proprietary, only available from Adobe, and Adobe had sole authority as to their future enhancements, pricing, etc., which is true. At the time, Apple was going HTML5, which was an open platform. And let's face it, Steve likes to be in control. If they were going to support Adobe Flash, they needed to work with Adobe on updates, releases, and security. And this letter was kind of their final nail in the coffin for Flash, as in November 2011, Adobe said they would stop production of Flash altogether. I mean, once YouTube started using HTML5 instead of Flash, it was really over. In 2013, Adobe servers were hacked with a massive credit card leak. Almost 3 million encrypted customers' credit cards and login data were taken, with 150 million usernames and hash passwords taken as well. Which now, that's every fucking Tuesday, but back then, that was a lot. So Adobe has always had a problem with piracy. The software, especially when they started creating suites with Creative Suite, has always been expensive. Which, fair enough, it's not like MS Paint or the random video editing software you got with your brand new digital camera. Adobe's programs are industry-leading tools that can do pretty much anything, and they're so good that people who aren't in the industry wanted to use them. See, by now we had the rise of personal websites, forums, and even proto-social media. Flickr, Friendster, MySpace, DeviantArt, and hosting sites like AngelFire or GeoCities allowed a lot more people to start modifying, editing their personalities online. Digital photographers liked Photoshop and Lightroom. Digital artists liked Photoshop and vector programs like Illustrator. Wacom tablets started becoming mainstream, and the off-the-shelf creative programs were not evolving quick enough to cater to these more and more technical requirements. So these people found ways of getting these programs through deep discounts with educational emails or through piracy. This was the age of Pirate Bay, Napster, ISO rips, and CD keys, so instead of paying the very hefty price tag of Creative Suite, they decided to pirate it. Now, while it was a large user base that pirated it, Adobe still had the massive income of corporations and freelancers who purchased the suites. They were never in trouble. Plus, you couldn't connect to the internet with these pirated programs, you couldn't get updates, and there was no upgrade path, which were always cheaper than buying a new version. Pirates were stuck with Creative Suite 2 or 3 while Creative Suite 6 was being shown off. Now, if you ask Adobe, they said the piracy was an issue, security was an issue, and that they wanted to find a way to unify your Creative Suite without versioning. So in 2013 came the subscription system, or what they called Software as a Service, aka SaaS. This was being sold alongside CS6 until it wasn't anymore. You could still buy CS6, but it was hard to find the physical copy, and Adobe was promoting their subscription service even more. And then finally, the death of CS6 came with no CS7 in sight. You now had to subscribe monthly or yearly to Adobe to use their software. And here's the main problem with that. Most updates to the program you use are not necessary. Adobe has always done increment updates to their software, with large updates usually taking place within 2 or 3 versions after. For example, Photoshop CS1 really wasn't that different from Photoshop CS2. However, Photoshop CS5 had enough updates and features added to it that you could justify a purchase. So a lot of design houses stuck with one system until they saw it necessary to update, or the operating system they were using no longer supported the software. With a subscription, you can't do that anymore. If you stop paying, you lose access to that software. Period. They also said it would help stop piracy. However, people were very quick to figure out how to get the software without paying a subscription to it, and in terms of Adobe's claims that it would just be one version with continuous updates, that was a lie too. Now we have Photoshop 2017, 2018, 2019, with the Creative Cloud application kind of being a bit flaky with updating, uninstalling, installing new versions. 9 times out of 10, you now have 2 versions of Photoshop on your computer. And since you have to always be connected, there have been times when the system has been down due to high usage or attacks or issues on Adobe's side where you couldn't use the program. Yes, you paid for it that month. Yes, you have a license to use it. And yes, you work in a very competitive market where any downtime is money lost. So when this happens, mind you, it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, you lose a lot of money or you're staying late to make up for that time. In reality, Adobe has always had gaps in the way they make money. When a new version of Creative Suite came out, they saw a spike in purchases. But during the time there was no new software or a version worth upgrading to, the income would pretty much flatline. However, with the subscription, that would always have a steady flow of income. Now keep in mind, they're not the small company they used to be. They hold events, market themselves, and even host or fund events. They spend a lot of money, a lot of our subscription money, to do this. But let's not forget the real concern here, the real evil here. You pay for everything but own nothing. In the short term, the subscription model is cheaper, but if you subscribe for multiple years, you're paying way more than you would ever if you just purchased a physical disc and waited a few versions to upgrade. And even if you did upgrade every version, the upgrade path was always cheaper. And if something happened to the online servers, you could still use the programs because you had a CD key. As I said, this wasn't to help the users, because with corporations and big business, it never is. And yes, you can say this really only affects the freelancers or the enthusiasts, and yes, it does. But let me explain. I learned how to use a lot of these apps in school. I didn't have to pay for them, and then later I got these programs through a college email discount. Now, I wouldn't be able to afford this program by myself on a yearly basis if I'm just starting out. This is an investment, and you have to make sure you'll make enough money that first year to justify the cost of Creative Suite. And a lot of us can't go to school because of cost. A lot of us can't train to use these programs because of cost. But a lot of us have talent. Talent that is locked behind a subscription paywall. If you want to talk about the wealth gap in this country, here's a perfect example of it. But real talk here, the price is too high for entry for the majority of people. So people with real talent are locked out because they can't pay. And if you're a designer, you know the per application price is bullshit because no one is just going to use one application. You have to go all in. And remember, Adobe purchased all these companies. They own the creativity side. There is no competition. There is no incentive for Adobe to be user focused. But let's get back to the timeline because we're starting to see changes in the company. In 2016, Adobe Flash Professional was changed to Adobe Animate, as it was trying to switch to HTML5 tools. But it didn't pan out for Adobe, as in 2017, they said Flash would stop distribution towards the end of 2020. In October 2018, Adobe changed its name from Adobe Systems Incorporated to Adobe Inc. And 2019, they released a suite of apps for the iPad, which required an Adobe subscription, of course. Now, the last death blow to Flash was in 2020, when Safari updated and killed off Flash support altogether, and so did all the other major browsers, with Adobe even blocking Flash from running in 2021. As there was no more security features, no more updates, and Adobe Flash was infamous for creating those fake looking folders that would say your computer is taking over or you need more space. Yeah, all those were Flash. It was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and Adobe had to make sure they scorched the earth of that program. Now, in recent years, or as I like to say, same shit, different day, other programs were coming out to compete with Adobe. In 2020, Adobe was going to merge with Figma for an astonishing $20 billion. And if you didn't know, Figma was a direct competitor to XD, a web design based platform, and which from what I hear was a lot better than XD in every way. However, due to pressures from the UK and EU regulations, the merger was abandoned, where Adobe was required to pay Figma a reverse termination fee of $1 billion in cash. This is not stock options, this isn't like fake money, well, it's cash. I mean, thank God for the EU, otherwise we'd all be screwed to follow one giant corporation who could change whatever the fuck they wanted, which is kind of what we have right now. So, whatever, because none of this compares to the infamous Terms of Service spectacular. Around April or May of 2024, people started noticing Adobe's Terms of Service. Now, these terms were around for a while, but once someone actually read it and started posting its questionable literature, all hell broke loose. Some items included they may access your content through manual or automated methods, such as for content review, but one of the big ones were they may train artificial intelligence with individual user work. On Wednesday, June 5th of 2024, Adobe updated their Terms of Service, I believe in reaction to the news. But this was done in the worst way possible. When you tried to sign in, it redirected you to the website that you could not close or back out to even to log in. You had to accept the TOS in order to do anything. A day after that, the bloggers, the video essayists were going hard on trying to translate those terms of services. And by June 10th, Adobe released an updated terms of use to clarify what those terms of services actually meant, meaning they didn't spy on you or use AI to steal your work, allegedly. However, that's not what it said in Photoshop until they removed that literature on June 12th. I mean, I just have to applaud Adobe for masterpiece of a train wreck here. Now, a lot of people said this is what they meant all along, and we just misinterpreted the language. I mean, it was written legalese, and none of us got what they were trying to say. So let's explain this Photoshop thing, that from what I hear was always checked, and you wouldn't have known about it because who actually goes here, like, at all? And seeing this kind of avoids anything they say afterwards, I mean, right? Because it's a lie. Anyway, on June 17th, the US government actually sued these motherfuckers, accusing the company of harming consumers by enrolling them in the most expensive subscription plan without clearly disclosing the huge early termination fees associated with it. Fees that could actually reach hundreds of dollars. In a past video, we talked about dark patterns, dark design, and Adobe did exactly that to a T. The Department of Justice claimed their cancellation process was confusing, and eventually an Adobe executive admitted the early termination fee was like heroin for Adobe. No way to kill it off without taking a big business hit, apparently. Adobe also used retention teams to keep people from canceling their services, meaning the site used page misdirects, asking for your password to log in over and over again before you could cancel it. And if you called, there were mandatory drop calls, so you would have to call again. I mean, goddamn, these people are evil. Then on June 18th, they released the new updated terms of services, with one of their lawyers kind of talking down to all of us in the video explaining what they actually meant, but the cream of the crop cringeworthy content was released by their employees putting out videos on their own social media accounts to talk favorably about the updated TOS, where you can clearly see they're reading a script. And the updated TOS really didn't change much from the original TOS, but then again, a lot of what here is what a lot of other cloud-based sharing system platforms have. Adobe has a lot of automated systems that talk to each other, and they need certain access and permissions to do that efficiently. Moving the cloud, auto logins, programs talking to other programs, and networks like Behance and their cloud-based storage system, yes, it can be intrusive, but also I guess it is kind of needed for what they're doing. Now, as I was writing this script and filming now, Adobe Firefly came out, and it seems to be loved by a lot of people, but I would like to mention that if what was shown on that Photoshop screen is true, a lot of Firefly is coming from us, meaning they took what we worked on. They took our creations, our designs, our creative insight, and made a learning machine spy on us. If that's true, that's Adobe pretty much giving the big to all of us, to you, to me. Whoever used that program, who's paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, they used us as tools to make their AI, Firefly, do what it does now. Now, some of us don't believe that, some of us do believe that, some of us don't even know what Firefly is. What do I think about Adobe? Honestly, I still use Adobe because it's what I'm used to. I've been using these programs heavily for about 30 years now, and it's hard to move to another program because you do have to learn them. And I live and work in a world where time is money. I know all the shortcut keys for most Adobe programs, I know how to troubleshoot, how they work together with other programs, and what their limitations are. It's very hard to give this up. I actually remember purchasing a copy of CS6 with my own money and thinking I made it. I can make enough of my own income that I can actually purchase this. And CS6 was going to be my long-term program. Screw it if they made CS7. I'm never going to upgrade till CS10. Then the subscription came out, and slowly CS6 started to become buggy, hard to run. Features started coming out on the subscription version that would be very helpful to me. And so I committed to the subscription. Can I pirate this new version? Probably. Is it worth it to me to do so? Not really. And as I get older, I probably won't be able to justify paying this much, and I'll probably cancel it, and then it's all over. I don't think Adobe should get all the hate they've received, but I also think they lost the mark on who these programs were built for. They pioneered a movement to give the power to the creatives. They allowed freelancers, hobbyists, and probably helped a lot of people start revolutions, causes, and movements because it gave the power of the printing press, a production of typesetting, to us. I can't state how important these two guys were in the industry. I can't state how important Illustrator was to the community, how important Premiere Pro is to the indie scenes, or even everyone you watch right here on YouTube. Yeah, I'm sure the companies that Adobe swallowed up or other creatives might have created similar programs, but who knows, right? That's why it's so infuriating when they probably used AI training models to steal our work to create the Firefly app. That we constantly have to check the TOS for each individual application's preference to make sure we're not opting into something that takes away our rights or licenses. It sickens me that, like health insurance, like car insurance, we're always paying for what will probably be an astronomical price in the long run. That as soon as we stop paying, it's lights out. The program won't work. You're done. But that's big business. That's a corporation for you. There's marketing and then there's reality. Adobe is not your friend. Adobe innovates slightly on their revisions, but just enough to keep you subscribed so their shareholders are happy, so their CEO is happy. If you can't pay, they don't care. And most of Creative Cloud is not theirs. They purchased these companies so they would have no competition. They would own the creative world, and they do. And they own you. I mean, I'm glad people are figuring it out right now and moving over to other programs, and that other developers are picking up the slack and creating truly great programs for creatives. Because monopolies are bad. Corporations are bad. Eventually, they always turn into that villain, if they weren't from the start. And don't think for a second the programs you're using right now to defeat Adobe are safe. If the company that made them gets big enough, they could turn into the same thing you hate right now. Or be purchased by Adobe because they want that money. Look at Figma. That's why I'm glad there's people like us who call them out on their shit. developers who want to create something that isn't just a money grab. We live in a pretty greedy world, but there are people that just want to see the world create. That was good. But it is hard to leave Adobe. I mean, when applying for a job, they still ask if you know Adobe Creative Cloud, InDesign, Photoshop. It's been a while since anyone has asked for Quark Express, but for a long time, after Quark was no longer the leading platform, people kept asking for that. So Creative Cloud isn't going away in the job market anytime soon. Requirements for that aren't going away. So while it's great to learn alternative programs, if you're in a design house or you're being hired full-time or even part-time for a creative or marketing job, you're probably going to use an Adobe program and should know how to use it. Going back to Quark Express, because in their own hubris, they did not innovate enough. They thought they were too big to fail, and were blinded by the seeds being planted by Adobe to have total market domination. It didn't happen overnight, but when they realized what was happening, it was too late. And I feel eventually Adobe will go that route. They keep trying to include everything, that they're forgetting about the core market, designers, creatives. These are industry-leading products that are being bastardized to keep up with the latest trend in mobile tools with social media. Meanwhile, these other applications that are coming out are reminiscent of Adobe of old, or the companies they purchased in the 80s and 90s at least. Adobe has in the past silenced these companies by buying them outright, but hopefully they can't do that anymore, because while Adobe was the key in jumpstarting the creative revolution, it's trying to kill it right now. The current CEO joined Adobe in 1998 as a senior vice president of worldwide product development. In 2007, he replaced Bruce as CEO, and 6 years later, Creative Suite was dead, and perpetual payment was the norm. And I will leave the story at that. So let me know what you think about all this. Do you still use Adobe? Do you care about the subscription, their practices, and the companies they are eating up? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. What do you mean warp stick?
Chop, chop. Send a note to mother,